Tonight on Primetime Politics, a meeting of Canada's First Ministers.
One of the great strengths of Canada is different perspectives focused on standing up for Canadians. That's what this is all about.
For the second time in just 3 weeks, the Prime Minister gets together with the country's premiers, talking Trump, tariffs, and what Canada will do in response. Coming up, we'll speak with the New Brunswick Premier about what was said during the call. Also, preparing for another Trump administration. The president of the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association will join us this evening. We'll find out how they are reacting to the tariff threat from the incoming president. This is Primetime Politics. Hello everyone, I'm Michael Serapio. Canada's First Ministers just wrapped up a virtual meeting this evening, the second meeting between the Prime Minister and the country's premiers, to address that social media post written by Donald Trump 3 weeks ago. Now, in that post, Donald Trump threatened to slap 25% tariffs on all Canadian goods unless he saw action on two security concerns: the transport of illegal drugs across the Canada-US border and irregular migration. Tonight, the Prime Minister, along with the Finance and Public Safety Ministers, addressed premiers and outlined their plan to tighten security along the border and also address what could be done to hit back if any U.S. tariff came into being.
The idea of jointly working together was very encouraging for us. We're going to incorporate many of the positive suggestions that the premiers made into finalizing our border plan. And then obviously a priority will be to share details of this plan with the incoming Trump administration and with Canadians in the coming days.
So our emphasis right now is on talking to our American friends and neighbors, on having a very broad outreach that is happening from the federal government. Premiers are part of that outreach. Business leaders are getting in touch with their American partners. Labor leaders are getting in touch with their American partners. And when it comes to the economy, what we are all talking about is how this is an economic relationship that works. It is an economic relationship which is balanced and mutually beneficial.
With more on tonight's meeting of Canada's First Ministers, we're now joined by Susan Holt, Premier of New Brunswick. Premier, thank you for making the time.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Listen, I want to begin with what you heard from the Prime Minister, a plan to deal with security concerns being raised by Donald Trump. What did you make of what you heard from Justin Trudeau?
Well, I thought that there was quite a bit of detail shared by the Prime Minister with the First Ministers. They went through a number of different elements of the plan, some that were legislative, regulatory, security. We talked about increased personnel, increased investment, how we're going to better detect and deal with fentanyl. We talked about RCMP and DEA partnerships. We talked about new FPT tables to address border security. It was a pretty comprehensive plan that the Prime Minister laid out.
Comprehensive, although we're now just a few weeks away from the inauguration of Donald Trump. Do you think it will be passed and implemented before Inauguration Day in Washington?
I think we'll be able to make enough progress to demonstrate to our partners to the south that we are serious about border security. We have strong, secure borders between Canada and the U.S. right now, and we continue to invest to ensure that they stay that way. So I think that there's a strong case to be made here.
Okay, a strong case, as you say. You know, it was interesting, though. We heard from Premier Ford right out of that meeting of Ontario, and Premier Ford is the current chair of the Council of the Federation. He clearly said that the border is a federal responsibility. But I'm wondering, you, as Premier of New Brunswick, do you see a role for your government, for your province, in tackling the issues that are being raised by Donald Trump, drugs and migrants in particular?
Well, I think it's a partnership. Certainly, New Brunswick has a significant border with Maine and an extremely active port that brings in a lot of goods that go directly into the U.S. And so we want to make sure that that port continues to grow and thrive. And we want to make sure that what has been a very peaceful border between the New Brunswick and Maine remains so. So we have on-the-ground knowledge, firsthand knowledge of how that's working everywhere from Edmundston right down to St. Stephen. And we can share that and partner with the federal government and with our counterparts in the U.S. To make sure that we're investing in the right places, that we're catching trends as soon as they happen, so that we can continue to have the kind of security that we've enjoyed for the generations.
You talk about the active border with Maine. I'm wondering if you've had a chance to reach out to the Maine governor and have discussions around this social media post put up 2 weeks ago.
Well, the governor and I have been matching up our calendars, and we have a conversation coming very shortly, but we actually were just on a collective call with the New England governors and the Atlantic premiers last night to talk about the integrated nature of our two regional economies and the importance of a lot of the products that move from Atlantic Canada into the U.S., particularly electricity and oil and energy products, forestry, lumber products, agricultural, seafood products, and others. And so we really got the sense from our colleagues in New England that they saw how these kinds of tariffs could be hurtful to their economies. And so we're building allies together to make sure that we can prevent that kind of pain from being experienced for Americans as well as for New Brunswickers and Canadians.
Okay, building allies, as you say, but I'm wondering how much of this evening was focused on a strategy, I guess, to hit back in terms of retaliatory tariffs. What was said on that front?
We talked a little bit about retaliatory tariffs. They weren't the main focus of the conversation tonight, but certainly we have to be prepared for every possibility, and we have to be prepared should these tariffs come into place that we're there to fight back. And so that list is being built. All of us are participating in what makes sense to go on the list for our provinces and our economies, and it's something that we're preparing that hopefully we won't have to use.
Okay, now it's interesting because the Prime Minister going into the meeting talked about the importance of a Team Canada approach. He's been talking about that since the Truth Social post a couple of weeks ago. But we also know that there are provinces doing their own outreach. And I'm wondering from you whether or not you are worried about New Brunswick and its concerns getting lost in the shuffle if, for example, certain industries, certain provinces look for sectoral carve-outs from any tariff.
Well, one of the interesting things about New Brunswick's economy, and I think you'll find this is consistent across Canada, is that we share a lot of the same sectors of importance with various neighbors. So certainly in New Brunswick, there's a significant amount of oil that gets exported from New Brunswick into the U.S., some 320,000 barrels a day. We share that in common with Alberta. We have a significant seafood trade that we share with other parts of Atlantic Canada. We have significant trade in lumber. We share that with BC and other provinces. We're concerned about cultural industries. We share that with Quebec. So there is actually a lot of connectivity between the concerns of each province for their economies and what we share with other provinces. So I think Team Canada will continue to be strong because we're having regular communications. We've connected, I think, 3 times on this so far. We're going to do it again this weekend. And those conversations are going to continue to make sure that each of us is aware of the unique needs of their province and prepared to support each other as a unified team.
So you're not worried about individual provinces doing their own outreaches?
Well, I think those individual outreaches are positive. We're doing the same. You know, we have business leaders and people like myself that are reaching out to our connections in the U.S. To make the economic case, reaching out to the places where there's strong integration between our companies and the products that we export. And the same thing is happening all along the border between other provinces and the states and the places where they're doing a lot of business. And so all of that is going to help us strengthen the case to make it clear to the Trump administration that the tariffs he suggested will be really economically devastating for the U.S. So I think everybody participating in that activity helps make the case stronger.
Premier Holt, again, I appreciate the time. As always, thank you for this.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Now, as I said, Ontario's Premier also spoke this evening as this year's chair of the Council of the Federation. He shared his thoughts on the meeting and also talked about what Canada might do if Trump moves forward with his tariff threat.
We need to be ready. We need to be ready to fight. This fight is coming 100% on January the 20th or January 21st. We don't know what extent this fight's going to go to. We will go to the extent of cutting off their energy, going down to Michigan, going down to New York State and over to Wisconsin. I don't want this to happen, but my #1 job is to protect Ontario, Ontarians and Canadians as a whole, since we're the largest province.
As we talk about the First Ministers and the importance of Canada-U.S. trade, one of the more invested industries in what will happen is the automotive sector. And that's because in Canada, the auto industry directly employs nearly 120,000 people. It also contributes about $12.5 billion to the national economy, and it is the second most exported product from Canada to the United States. So when U.S. officials talk tariffs, the Canadian auto industry listens. Well, joining us now is Flavio Volpe, president of the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association. Flavio, good to see you again. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me on, Michael.
Listen, as we see the First Ministers come together to strategize a way around Mr. Trump's tariff threat, I'm wondering what your association is doing right now to prepare for that kind of trade levy.
So we've seen this movie before in the Trump 1.0, and what we did to support the Team Canada effort was to inventory all the Canadian investments from Canadian auto parts suppliers in the U.S. What states, what component class, how many people are employed there, and how long they've been invested. And also shared all of the relationships that we have and the networks that we have in Washington and in other places like Lansing that would be helpful to both the federal government and, you know, in this case, of course, the First Ministers. We spent a lot of time talking with Premier Ford and his team. All of our networks and our information is constantly refreshed and at the disposal of, you know, the leads on engagement with our American partners.
And when you're doing that, what are you trying to prove? The very fact that the two markets, the two countries are so integrated that you can't really harm one without harming the other?
Yeah, well, we like to start with the first line of half of the cars made in Canada are made by American car manufacturers. And so you can't hurt Canada without hurting General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, Dodge, Ram. But then also, much more importantly, half of the parts that go into all the cars that are built here come from the U.S. and about 55% of the raw materials. But then different from the Canadian experience than maybe a Mexican one is Canadian auto parts companies have invested in 156 plants in 18 U.S. states and employ more than 45,000 Americans. So it's really not just two-way trade, but also two-way investment. We've been doing this all together for the last 120 years. And we're doing it to the benefit of the American intentions and the American interest. In automotive, the Canadian interest is completely overlapped with the American one. And so if there's ways to improve the relationship, then we're always ready to do it because 80% of the vehicles we make are sold into that market, and 62% of the vehicles that Canadians import come from American plants.
So do you actually think when Donald Trump talks about a 25% tariff, maybe even a 10% tariff, because that's really where he began, do you think that the automotive industry in Canada is actually protected from that?
Well, I'll remind your listeners that we talked about a 25% tariff on parts and cars in his first term, using national security cover, the Section 232 tariffs. Ultimately, what we were successful in having his officials understand, and they're the ones who are at the table having to negotiate what benefit they might derive from this, is that the first companies that get hurt by a tariff are American parts suppliers, either subcomponent suppliers sitting in the U.S. or here in Canada making parts for American cars. And then the second party that gets hurt is American consumer. How could we do better together? Well, we convinced them in the first term that we're their best partners to compete with China. Source of aluminum that they don't have. They don't have the smelter capacity for their Ford F-150s, never mind their military. But all of the critical minerals that go into batteries, that go into electric drive or hybrid or any of the applications where electrons are involved, we have the raw materials that they don't, that the Chinese do, and we have a common interest. We need the Americans to take that capacity. And they need us to process it.
So, of course, Mr. Trump made his tariff threat during the campaign. It upped it a couple of weeks ago when he put that social media post on his Truth Social account. I'm wondering if you've heard from American counterparts, what they're saying to you about this moment in time, whether they're expressing that you need to be calm about this or whether or not they too are concerned of what might be coming down the road.
Well, so many of them on both sides of the aisle are just generally amused by the way in which he speaks. And they hope that we don't take the bait. They do, though, understand that we understand that we should take the threat of tariffs seriously, and that he looks at trade balance as the entire report card on the health of a relationship. And so that we've got some work to do to understand, for them to understand and for him to understand that trade imbalance today with Canada is because Canadian sources supply 60% of the oil and gas needs for the American market. And so it's not, hey, by the way, we're selling you finished goods that you could otherwise employ Americans to make. It's this is what you need to fuel your economy, and we have it, and we eagerly want to partner with you to sell it. And we were successful before. I think with patience, I think we can be successful again. But we should all be ready for a certain amount of pain. He did put national security tariffs on the aluminum that his own military needed in 2019, and that lasted 10 months. But what I remind Canadians, especially those of us who are having these conversations in the U.S., is that on January 21st, on day one for him, he's going to be picking fights with essentially the rest of the world. We're operating in a vacuum right now, as he's talking almost exclusively about us and Mexico with a China context. It's very difficult to be the president of the United States with all of the domestic responsibilities and have trade fights with everybody around the world and to be focused. And so don't do anything to exacerbate the moment. He is kidding. He is trolling us. But he has done that throughout his career to try to use whatever leverage he has in a supplier relationship that he has. And he sees Canada, in this case, as a supplier to the American consumer.
Well, we are watching what happens, of course, but always good to get your thoughts on this. Flavio Volpe, thank you for the time.
Always good to talk to you, Michael.
And you. Time now for a look at what else happened in politics today. The Bank of Canada is once again lowering interest rates, and for the second time in a row cutting by 50 basis points. That brings the benchmark rate down to 3.25%, driven by slower GDP growth, higher unemployment, and lower inflation numbers. This is the fifth straight interest rate cut by the bank since June. TikTok is challenging the order to shut down its Canadian operations, the company filing for a judicial review in federal court, hoping to pause the order and eventually overturn it. Last month, the federal government told TikTok to wind down operations in this country, citing security concerns. And finally, Newfoundland and Labrador are expected to sign a new deal with Quebec that would see new terms created for Churchill Falls. The massive hydro dam is owned by and located in Newfoundland and Labrador, but Quebec, which buys electricity from the plant at a reduced rate, resells the power and has made billions from the arrangement. The new deal will reportedly address the issue. Premiers Andrew Furey and Francois Legault are expected to make the announcement in St. John's tomorrow. You can watch it right here on CPAC. So we heard it again tonight, the federal government underlining the importance of a Team Canada approach with any trade challenge. Now, it's a strategy that was first developed back in 2017. The federal government bringing together players from all levels of government, from industry and from labor, to tackle the challenge of the first Trump administration, specifically the then president's decision to take the United States out of NAFTA and trigger a renegotiation of the Continental Trade Agreement. And while a tariff threat may be the opening salvo, CUSMA, the trade deal that succeeded NAFTA, is up for renegotiation in 2026. Well, joining us now is Senator Hassan Yussuff. In 2017, he was president of the Canadian Labour Congress and sat on the government's NAFTA Advisory Council. Senator, thank you for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
So, I want to begin with some comments we heard from Donald Trump over the weekend because, he gave an interview. It was with American media, and he was talking about how much he liked tariffs, partly economic, but also as a negotiating tool to get concessions on other fronts. Hearing that, when you look at what the president, or the incoming president, has said, do you think this tariff threat is more a negotiating tactic or a legitimate tariff threat against Canada?
Well, I think we have to take it seriously, and whatever the president is saying, we shouldn't pretend that it's not what he's saying, because ultimately, at the end of the day, we don't know. And it's hard to predict what Donald Trump is thinking, much less what he wants. And I think for a country that has to rely so much on our trade to go to the United States, I think we have to take it seriously. It is important, of course, that the country actually comes together at the premier level, within the House of Commons, but also at the municipal level, where we are actually speaking with one voice. I hope the government does create a structure where they can bring Canadians from a variety of backgrounds, businesses, labor, social movement, to actually help the government and guide us through, because we are going to be in a very, very difficult moment in this country. What got us through the last time was the fact we had unity and purpose to what we were doing in regard to the renegotiations of NAFTA. This time, of course, there will be some renegotiations, but the president's threat immediately on tariff really has a tremendous challenge to the economy as a whole, but for jobs from regions to regions across the country. So I think we need to really put our mind to recognize we don't know what the president means. We shouldn't try to guess what he means, but ultimately we should take him seriously at his word and deal with it in a clear, concise way. There is no reason why the United States should impose tariff on Canada, on anything, period. We are a fair trading country. We respect the relationship with the United States, but that does not mean that the president sees it that way.
Okay, but the two things you're pointing out, you're saying there needs to be a process that works so that people can feel free to give their opinion, and also there needs to be a united front. So let's begin there. You know, with the united front, do you think that is what is emerging right now? Because while, you know, we are having these first ministers meetings, we're also hearing from the premiers of Alberta, Ontario, Quebec. They'll be making their own outreach as well to Americans they know. Are you worried that the united front is not emerging this time around, or is it too early to tell?
I think it's too early to tell. It's fair for premiers to reach out to their counterpart and governors in different states where they can have relationship and make the argument, but ultimately the federal government is the one that's going to negotiate with the United States. And what we saw from the last time, because of our unity, we were able to buttress any of the Americans' threat to Canada, but equally we were successful in the renegotiation of the agreement. This time around will be no different, and I think as some of the premiers are new, it would be really important for them to learn from the last time that the unity of them and the Prime Minister and the federal government need to be in sync. It cannot be different messages just because they believe they can score some points, because that will not get us anywhere, because the president don't really care about that. He has an observation, he has an opinion, and ultimately he has veto in what will be agreed to, and we need to recognize the only person who will conduct a relationship with the President of the United States is the Prime Minister of our country and his team, that whoever he's going to appoint to lead those negotiations with the United States.
Are you worried that we're in a more partisan time, though, compared to the first time around? Because not only do we have different political players, leaderships have changed to different parties, not so much the Liberal Party, but other parties' leadership has changed. And in addition to that, we're approaching an election year. Are you worried that those partisan identities and priorities will affect the unity?
I think it could, but the consequence of that is this tremendous damage we'll do to the country and our economic well-being over time. And I hope opposition leaders, premiers will put that aside, recognizing we're one country, we're one people. If we don't stand together, each one of us will lose in different ways, and that is not a good thing for our people. It's not good for the economy, and it's not good for millions of Canadians who are dependent on our export to the United States. I know it's hard to get people there, and these are not uncertain times. There are bigger issues in the world, not just with the United States, that we're going to have to contend with. But I do believe, given early part now with the discussions and the premiers and the Prime Minister, the country will settle down, recognize we are going to have to come together to sit down with our American counterpart to get them to appreciate we are a good trading partner, we're a good ally, and by the way, we've been a good friend throughout history. Why would we want to disrupt that? Simply because the president may have an angst about a particular matter. Yeah, it may require us to address that in a way that will give them some comfort, but equally we have issues. I think the United States can work better to help us deal with those issues. We have a lot of, if you talk to border community across this country where guns have been flowing in from the United States, causing a whole lot of harm to our citizens in our country, We would like them to do a better job and try to interdict those guns before they get across our border in this country. They may have issues about, people crossing, but we also have people crossing from the United States and Canada. So I don't think we should be pointing finger and try to accuse our national government of not doing what is right. Let's figure out how we can address those issues. But at the same time, what I did learn from the NAFTA Council, a lot of like-minded Canadians are committed to helping the national government with clear, concise advice as to how we can work through these issues in the best interest of the economy, the workers in this country, but also in our long-term relationship with the United States. It did serve the federal government really well, and if you look back at the negotiation and assess it, no matter who you are, in a partisan, non-partisan way, we were successful at the end because we had that unity of purpose.
A unity of purpose. I do wonder, though, because I'm quickly running out of time, but I do want to ask this, because here we are reacting to a man who's not yet the U.S. president again. His inauguration is not for another month or so. And should we be concerned that we are reacting to these social media comments from Donald Trump and essentially talking about migration, border policies, trade, with a man who's not yet the U.S. president?
Well, I think what you may notice when he becomes president, the language ain't going to be any different than what we're hearing right now. The president, for the most part, is not predictable like other leaders. You can have a conversation and maybe you might quiet down. Again, if you have an angst about something, he will say publicly, regardless of what the consequence might be. I think we can learn well from the last time. We did have, I think, a better outcome as a result of understanding where he was coming from, but equally trying to reason with his administration, and he has, well, hopefully he'll have some good people we could talk with. But at the same time, I think there's a recognition, regardless the fact that he's not in office, we need to be prepared as a nation. But it also speaks to another issue that I think the country needs to come to grips with. We really need to diversify our trade and not be so dependent on the American market. And if we don't do that and see this as an important time for us to start thinking about it, we will be back time and time again. By the way, we're talking about what the president would do when he becomes in office. We don't know what he will continue to do while he is in office. And I think we need to prepare ourselves, because this is his last term. He will not be seeking re-election, and he would not be concerned about the consequence of the decision he might make might damage our country and our economy at the same time. So I think Canadians need to be prepared for a long haul here. Tariff may be one of the first issues, but I'm sure it's not going to be the last issue with this administration and with this president.
Senator, appreciate the time. Thank you for this.
Thank you kindly.
And that is our program for this Wednesday. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. We're back tomorrow evening. Until then, take care.